It was a cold, overcast Thursday afternoon at Crestwood High. The bell had just rung, and the students filed into their classrooms, ready for the last few hours of the day. In room 207, Mrs. Fletcher's history class had just begun. Jake, a quiet senior, sat in the back, doodling absent-mindedly in his notebook. He barely noticed Mrs. Fletcher's lesson, his thoughts far from history and drifting towards the weekend. Suddenly, the loudspeakers crackled to life. "Attention, all students and faculty. We are now in lockdown. This is not a drill." The message echoed eerily through the silent halls. Mrs. Fletcher's eyes widened in alarm, her usual calm demeanor replaced by uncertainty. Without hesitation, she turned off the lights and motioned for the students to gather at the back of the room. The blinds were quickly drawn, and the room plunged into an uneasy darkness. "Stay quiet," Mrs. Fletcher whispered. Her voice barely carried over the sound of shuffling students as they huddled together in the corner. Jake's heart pounded in his chest. Lockdowns were rare, and they were almost always drills. But something about this felt wrong. There was a tension in the air, a palpable fear that gripped everyone in the room. From his spot in the corner, he glanced out through the narrow slit in the blinds. The hallway outside was dark and still, unnervingly empty. Minutes passed. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the occasional shuffle of feet or a nervous cough. Then, faintly at first but growing louder, Jake heard it. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, echoing down the hallway. Mrs. Fletcher's face tightened. She raised a hand signaling for absolute silence. The students complied, their breaths shallow and ragged as they listened. The footsteps grew closer, heavier with each step. They didn't sound like those of a security guard or teacher. They were too slow, too deliberate, like someone stalking prey. The door handle rattled. Everyone in the room froze, eyes wide with fear. Jake's pulse quickened as the handle jiggled again, harder this time, as if someone on the other side was testing the lock. His mouth went dry. Mrs. Fletcher crept toward the door, her face pale but determined. She glanced through the tiny window, her expression unreadable. Slowly, she backed away from the door and returned to the students. "It's locked," she mouthed, her voice barely a breath. The footsteps stopped. Silence once again filled the air, but it was far from comforting. There was something wrong, terribly wrong. Suddenly, the door creaked, slowly swinging open despite the lock. The lights flickered once, twice, then went out entirely, plunging the room into darkness. Panic swept through the students. Mrs. Fletcher grabbed a flashlight from her desk, flicking it on and pointing it toward the door. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure. It was tall, impossibly tall, and its features were obscured in shadow. Its eyes, if they were eyes, glowed faintly, casting an unnatural light that sent a shiver down Jake's spine. The figure's body seemed to shimmer, like smoke struggling to hold a shape. It took a step into the room, its movements slow and fluid, as though it wasn't bound by the laws of nature. Who are you?" Mrs. Fletcher stammered, her voice barely audible. The figure tilted its head, as though considering the question. Then it smiled. Its mouth stretched unnaturally wide, far beyond the limits of a human face, revealing rows of jagged, sharp teeth. It was a smile devoid of warmth, of anything remotely human. "I've been waiting," the figure hissed, its voice a low, guttural rasp that seemed to echo from everywhere and nowhere at once. The students cowered in fear, huddling closer together. Jake's heart raced, his mind struggling to make sense of what he was seeing. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Mrs. Fletcher raised the flashlight higher, the beam cutting through the darkness, illuminating the figure fully. Its skin, or what passed for skin, was black as coal, its surface shifting like liquid. The figure's limbs were too long, its fingers ending in claws that scraped lightly against the doorframe as it stepped closer. "We need to go," Jake whispered, his voice barely audible to those around him. But before anyone could move, the figure raised a hand, its long, clawed fingers outstretched. The room filled with a low, vibrating hum, like the sound of electricity surging through the air. The temperature dropped sharply and the air grew thick, suffocating. Jake felt an overwhelming sense of dread, like something horrible was about to happen. The figure's smile widened as it moved closer. "I'm here to feed." Suddenly, the door slammed shut behind it with a deafening bang, and the lights in the hallway outside flickered wildly. The figure turned its gaze toward Jake, its glowing eyes locking onto him. "No," Jake whispered, backing up against the wall. He could feel its pull, a force drawing him closer against his will. Just as the figure reached out for him, a loud alarm blared through the school's PA system, the sound sharp and piercing. The figure flinched, its form flickering like a glitch in a video game. Jake saw his chance. "Run!" he shouted. The students bolted for the door, shoving their way past the flickering figure. Jake grabbed Mrs. Fletcher's arm, pulling her with him. The hallway was a blur of chaos, students screaming and running in every direction. The figure screeched, its body writhing as it tried to maintain its form. But the alarm, louder, more intense than any lockdown alarm, was tearing it apart. With one final, bone-chilling scream, the figure disintegrated into a cloud of black smoke, vanishing into the ether. The students burst out into the main corridor, gasping for breath, their hearts racing. The lockdown was over, but the terror remained. No one spoke of what they saw that day, but the shadow in the halls would forever haunt Crestwood High. And if you're ever in a lockdown, listen closely. You never know what might be waiting on the other side of the door. If you want more terrifying stories that will keep you up at night, hit that like and subscribe button. Don't miss the next nightmare.